Well, welcome to the fifth and final portion of these online uh, talking about finding God's peace when we are in conflict. We have been looking at that at a time when the world is in chaos, confusion, and panic. And we are seeing God's people swept up into it just as much as the world is. Everything I have been talking about requires that a person in a conflict has to do something. Get some others around, pour into the word, pour into prayer, pour into the circumstances, speak God's truth into it, and choose to confess and forgive and bear burdens and be at peace in the midst of the storm. It is the power of our testimonies, as well as the power of the word, that defeats Satan. That's Revelation chapter 12, verses 9 through 11. So today is testimony time. The restoration service for the pastor in yesterday's message produced a big stain of grape juice at the bottom of the steps to the podium area. 15 years later, there was a upheaval within the church. There was a new pastor. Ellen and I happened to be going through town at the time, stopped in to say hello, and he was bemoaning the conflict. And I said, have you ever seen the stain up at the front of the sanctuary? He says, yeah, I've always wondered about that. I said, well, let me tell you the story. And I did. And it changed his approach, and the congregation was healed. In 1970, at the Asbury College, students were invited to give personal testimonies during the chapel service. Something happened, and the service lasted 144 hours. The word spread to 130 college campuses, and thousands of students came to Christ or recommitted themselves. You can find it under the Asbury Revival. In fact, Asbury had more than one. 1971, the Sutera family twins began a week-long crusade in Saskatchewan. It lasted 7 weeks. It involved 20 different denominations. They went from a church seating 300 to a church seating 1,800. By 1972, it had reached the West Coast and was producing 3,000 lay teams of people moving about Canada and the northern United States giving testimonies. It was triggered by the reconciliation of two old farmer brothers who had been fighting each other publicly for years. And God reconciled them at the first of the meetings, and they sang a duet to the congregation. And from that, the rest is history. Two men of a church had formed a business, both believing that the lifestyle of the other guaranteed that the finances necessary to cover startup would be there. Everything fell apart. Neither of them had the assets, and the pastor sent them to me. As I got the facts from them, I gently exposed to them their public deception of lifestyle. They repented, found a way to save the business, and went in front of their congregation and made a testimony. And the population of the congregation grew massively. A church of 120 years was being torn apart by 60 members signing a petition for removal of the pastor. I went among them, taking the pastor from person to person to person. What we found out was nobody had anything against the pastor. Everybody was working off of gossip and complaining by one man in the congregation. During an evening Wednesday night service, one of the members stood up and testified to what she had learned in a conflict of her own that had nothing to do with the church, and confessed her sins to the congregation. That congregation was healed. The pastor remained. The one man fled, and so saw no benefit from it. I was speaking at a father and son's Harvest Day banquet up in northwest Wisconsin. I told a little bit about my stormy relationship with my father. As I ended, I said, and the fact that I had found peace with him before his death. So as I ended, I said, okay, dads, get up and hug your kids, because this is a good time for it. Nobody moved. I'm standing there, and 2 steps down in front of me in a chair is a young man. There's a young man on each side of him. And then there's 2 old codgers on the sides of them. And I looked at the crowd and I said, I don't have a son with me today. So you, young man, pointing to the middle of the three, I'm going to hug you. And I went down and I got him up and I hugged him. And within seconds, every man in the room is bawling and hugging their kids because that boy lost his father the week before. Think about the crazy things that the Spirit may call upon us to do, and the dumb things we may do that become a testimony. In 1983, Chuck Colson wrote a book entitled Loving God. It was a bunch of true stories about people. By 1997, it had gone through 20 printings, translated into 20 languages, and more than 2 million copies were in circulation. Chapter 16 was the story of a zealous young judge in Elkhart, Indiana. Only God knows how many people have been impacted by what the world would see as my shame, but what I recognize as a great learning experience from the Lord about His truths. Lord, you know our every sin. You know our every misstep. You know all those that we have harmed. You know our angers, our bitternesses, our resentments that we have stored up from these conflicts. Help us get this stuff out from inside and on a table. Name it, claim it, bury it, and be at peace with you and our fellow man, so that we may glorify you in our words and deeds the rest of the days of our life. Amen. Have a wonderful weekend.